The first round of municipal elections in Brazil has come and gone. Brazilians in almost 5,600 municipalities went to the polls to pick new mayors and city council members. And the dispute was settled in all but 52 cities already on Sunday. And this week, we will discuss what conclusions can be drawn from the results, if any, key races that are still in play, and the effects of these local races on national politics. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. This is Explaining Brazil.
If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to our website, The Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Or you can go the extra mile and make a donation to our newsroom, tipping our journalists via our Buy Me a Coffee page. And you can also subscribe to our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, pledging a monthly contribution to our newsroom in exchange for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Our Buy Me a Coffee subscribers are Cristina Viu, Andrei Novoseltsev, Wild Rice, Jaciara de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Louise Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vrieswick, Alistair Townsend, Miller Renarcido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Jose Ozi Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. And our Buy Me a Coffee members come from all over the world, so please, if we're butchering the pronunciation of your name, please send us an email. If you too believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of our membership levels. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more.
Now, this week I'm joined by CD Silva, our Brasilia correspondent. Hello, CD.
Hi, Gustavo. Thank you for having me.
And Ewan Marshall, the Brazilian Report's deputy editor. Hello, Ewan.
Hi, Gustavo.
So, CD, let's start with you. I know it's always dangerous to draw definitive conclusions with fresh results from the oven, especially as Brazilian politics is constantly evolving, with new alliances and betrayals always happening. But what does the photograph of this moment tell us? Can we proclaim the forces that were the big winners on Sunday?
Yes, we can. Once again, the so-called big center won. So for our foreign readers, the big center is how Brazilians refer to a loose coalition of parties that are usually center or to the right of center, but they are not very ideologically committed, and they can be convinced to join either government or whoever the president is in exchange for pork, in exchange for roles within the administration. So a center party called the PSD elected the most mayors, 878 mayors out of Brazil's around 5,500 municipalities. And for the first time, the PSD has overpassed the MDB, which is Brazil's oldest surviving political party and traditionally had the title of electing the most mayors. MDB is now in second place with 847 mayors. And then you have other parties of the center-right as the big winners. Other big winner here is Gilberto Kassab, who was the former mayor of São Paulo, where you and are. Gilberto Kassab has played roles within basically all groups within Brazilian politics over the last 15 years or so. He's a major power broker in Brazil. And if I were to write one of those magazines for foreign readers, Gilberto Kassab would figure among the most powerful Brazilians you have never heard of. Of course, Gilberto Kassab is known for Brazilians of Paulo politics, but not so much for a foreign audience. And the reason I talk specifically about Kassab is not only his party elected the most mayors, but Kassab has been interviewed by O Globo newspaper, an interview that was published this Tuesday. And Kassab is saying in this interview that São Paulo Governor Tarcísio de Freitas should wait until 2030 to run for president. Tarcísio de Freitas is relevant. because he supported the re-election of Mayor Ricardo Nunes, who in a very tight race qualified for the runoff. And Gilberto Kassab, by saying that Tarcísio de Freitas should wait until 2030, not only he's saying that Tarcísio is not strong enough to contend against Lula in 2026, but that given the results of the race, Kassab is comfortable enough in saying, you need my support to run, so you better wait until 2030 because I am the kingmaker.
Now, you mentioned the PSD, the Social Democratic Party. I mean, not that these names in Brazil mean that much, but just for readers to know which party we're talking about. And I mean, including this almost 900 municipalities in which it has won, is Rio, where incumbent Mayor Eduardo Paes won by a landslide outright victory. Now, these results, they sort of crown the party's strategy since its creation in 2011, right? Because, like you said, Gilberto Kassab tries to operate in the background. And I mean, he described the PSD when it founded the party in 2011 as neither to the right, nor to the left, nor in the center, whatever that means. And I mean, the PSD is sort of a Noah's Ark with room for anybody who wants to join. And it is, like you said, open to join any sort of coalition. Let's remember that Gilberto Kassab was in the Dilma Rousseff cabinet. He then supported Dilma Rousseff's impeachment and joined the cabinet of Michel Temer, who followed Dilma and who was operating for her impeachment. Now, can you tell us a little bit about how parties such as the PSD operate? Because these are parties that are not focusing on the major races, right? I mean, the Rio election, Rio being one of the crown jewels, but this is more of an exception. If you see how they operate, they go for these lower profile offices. This is a party that is not eager to have a presidential candidate. So why that? When we see so many high-profile parties in Brazil always trying to have a viable presidential hopeful, that's not the case with the PSD and parties such as the PSD. Why is that, Cede?
Yes, you're correct. So some of the big center parties, especially the major ones such as PSD and União Brasil, they have a different business model. And this business model was facilitated in 2015 when Brazil's Supreme Court banned the use of corporate money, the use of corporate funds for electoral campaigns in the wake of the car wash scandal, etc. So when initially the Supreme Court banned corporate sponsors of electoral campaigns, initially they didn't have much to replace it. And this is the reason why in 2016, which was the first election since the decision, and it was a mayoral election as well, a lot of businessmen were elected mayor, such as João Dória in São Paulo and Alexandre Calil in my hometown of Belo Horizonte. And the reason was because the businessmen were the only people with money to self-fund their campaigns. But after this election, Congress and the lawmakers reacted to the Supreme Court decision by creating a very large public electoral fund, which basically means that the political leaders of the parties are much more powerful than before because they now get the electoral funds for free from the government, from the budget, and they don't need to knock door to door in campaigns or engineering companies or in banks and so on in order to get the funds. They have the funds already. So people like Gilberto Kassab, Valdemar Costa Neto, the head of the Liberal Party, they have the keys to the coffer, the public funds in their hands, and they don't need much effort. They don't even need to talk to the businessmen. So with this, they're now running a different business model where they prefer to be kingmakers and support people in power in exchange for something rather than running a risky campaign where they might lose. They still run big shot, powerful elections up until governor and senator, but not for president, because that is just too risky, especially when the polls will suggest that the race is very tight, such as in 2022, when it was a toss-up whether Lula or Bolsonaro would win. So in 2022, the PSD by Gilberto Kassab remained neutral. They didn't support any candidate at all. And a similar party with a similar business model, União Brasil, rather than supporting either Lula or Bolsonaro, they mounted a very cheap campaign for an extremely underdog Senator Soraya Tronic, who got less than 0.5% of the vote. And it really didn't, it wasn't a risky decision because since they were not supporting either Lula or Bolsonaro, they were not challenging whoever was the winner. So some parties in the big center in Brazil will do that. They will stay out of the presidential race and they will instead focus on winning the other offices. So this will be a bargaining chip for whoever the president is. So they win no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way you described it as a business model because it has indeed become a business. And I mean, we have three certainties in life: death, taxes, and the big center in the government coalition, whoever is in office. Now, what about Lula and Jair Bolsonaro? Because the Brazilian press every 2 years love to talk about how municipal elections influence national races and how national races influence local elections. Did we see the 2022 polarization between Lula and Bolsonaro reflecting in the mayoral races, or no, the fact that these are local races with very different issues at play actually made it a much different landscape?
I understand we saw that polarization, but just that the candidates that are closely aligned to either Lula or Bolsonaro are not as competitive in most major cities as Lula and Bolsonaro themselves are competitive. So, for example, if Bolsonaro wins by a landslide in a city like Belo Horizonte in 2022, Bolsonaro's candidate, Bruno Engler, qualified for the runoff, but with around 30% of the vote. So it doesn't amount to the same thing. It doesn't mean that if your support is some of the city, you have the same, your mayoral candidate will have the same support. The same thing in São Paulo. Lula won in 2022 in São Paulo city, but his candidate, Guilherme Boulos, got 29% of the vote and barely qualified for the runoff. So it doesn't fully translate the support for the presidential candidate and the support for the presidential candidate's candidate does not fully translate. As for the results, I understand that in Bolsonaro's position, I would be much more satisfied with the results than Lula. Bolsonaro candidates, either on his party or that favor his ideological views, have qualified for the runoff in several major cities, in Belo Horizonte, in Fortaleza, in Porto Alegre. His supported candidate almost clinched a victory in the first runoff despite the major floods in Porto Alegre. So I understand that Bolsonaro will be much more satisfied, where Lula has not saw an increase in the Workers' Party as much as would like. The Workers' Party grabbed more cities than before, is back to a growth, but mostly in small cities, and is currently running the underdog campaign because Boulos is definitely the underdog to beat Mayor Ricardo Nunes in São Paulo.
Now, let's focus on the Workers' Party for a bit because, like you said, this is not an election from which the Workers' Party can leave with a very sense of satisfaction. Because, like you said, it has only gained around 250 municipalities, mostly small ones, cities that are irrelevant for the national chessboard. And I would like to add the fact that we have seen something that it's not common for the Workers' Party, which is to abdicate from presenting its own candidates in major cities such as Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. In Rio, it latched on to Eduardo Paes, the uber popular mayor who cruised to re-election. But Paes did not need the Workers' Party, so he made very few concessions to the left and packed his coalition with staunch conservatives. And in São Paulo, it was the first time since the Workers' Party was created that it did not have its own candidate. Instead, it named the running mate for Guilherme Boulos, who belongs to the small Socialism and Freedom Party. And I mean, the Workers' Party also suffered very tough losses in Brazil's industrial belt, the ABC Paulista, which used to be a stronghold for the party. It is the party's political birthplace. When we are talking about state capitals, there is only realistic chance that the Workers' Party will win Fortaleza, and still it's uncertain. How do you see the state of the left after Sunday? It is a recovery from 2016 and 2020 when the Workers' Party was in the doldrums, but that bar was very low, right, today?
Yeah, it had a very low bar, but it is coming from 179 mayors in 2020 to 248 now in 2024. So it's still growth, but it's mostly in small cities. And also the left as a whole suffered a major symbolic defeat because Mayor Edmilson back in Belém, he's out of the runoff, and he was the only mayor of a capital of the Socialism and Freedom Party of Mr. Boulos. So his work was very badly assessed by voters, and he's now out of the runoff that is taking place in Belém, which is the city in the Amazon that is also going to host the Conference of the Parties of the Climate in late 2025. So it would be a major headquarters for Brazil as a whole, a major spotlight for Brazil and climate change back in late 2025. So I think the left is recovering, but it has suffered some defeats, and it's facing an uphill battle in São Paulo and even in Porto Alegre, despite the floods. So this means that the left is operating in a country that is very much now much more evidently right of center, and voters have really clenched to that position in several cities, and they are now openly right of center, with a growing base of evangelical vote, with a growing base of people in the agricultural community that identify with the right. And so the left is playing an increasingly harder game now in Brazil.
Yeah, especially because now we're seeing many candidates that are far less extreme than Jair Bolsonaro, which of course is not saying much, but still it makes them much more viable than a name like Bolsonaro. Now let me bring Ewan to our discussion. And Ewan, we had a few contests in Brazil decided by as much as a single vote in smaller towns. But we could say that the biggest nail biter on Sunday was the first round in São Paulo, right? Polls showed three leading candidates within spitting distance from each other, and the results confirmed these projections. In a city of more than 9.3 million voters, we had fewer than 82,000 votes separating the first candidate and the third candidate, the one who got excluded from the runoff. Can you talk a little bit about the São Paulo campaign? How did we get to a scenario where we had such a tightly contested vote, and ultimately, who qualified for the runoff?
Yeah, as you said, the polls said it was going to be tight, but they didn't say it was going to be that tight. Just to go quickly through the results here, the incumbent mayor, Ricardo Nunes, came in first in the first round with 29.48%. Keep that number in mind. In second place came the left-wing congressman Guilherme Boulos with 29.07%. See how close that is already. And then missing out on the runoff in third place was the far-right life coach and kind of wildcard candidate Pablo Marçal, who got 28.14%. So you see there's that tiny margin between those three candidates, especially between making the runoff and not making the runoff. And this São Paulo mayoral campaign was quite an eventful one. There was certainly a lot of things that happened throughout the start of the official campaign until Sunday. But to just kind of sum it up, in terms of those three candidates that I mentioned, you have two charismatic candidates in Guilherme Boulos and Pablo Marçal, and then you have the incumbent mayor, Ricardo Nunes, who he has very poor name recognition. He was never actually elected himself. He was elected as a deputy mayor back 4 years ago. And this is something that we've seen in other countries, is when you have the incumbent mayor, he has the controls of the public machine. And in the case of Ricardo Nunes, he has the controls and the support of much of the São Paulo City Council, which is key for his support. And also the fact that he himself hails from the south of São Paulo, which is a very populous and often overlooked part of São Paulo. You mentioned earlier that there's just over 9 million voters in the city. The south has 3 million on its own, and Ricardo Nunes polls very well there because that's where he's based politically. So that kind of helped really push him over the line, despite the fact that, you know, he doesn't have that kind of natural political charisma that Boulos and Pablo Marçal both have.
Now, there are electoral defeats and there are political defeats. And I define them as electoral defeats are those who, I mean, the candidate fails to get elected, but he either keeps or he enhances his or her political capital. Now, political defeats are bleaker for candidates who finish a race with a diminished political stature than before they enter the election. Pablo Marçal, who, like you said, finished third and almost got to the runoff but did not make it, his elimination was by no means a political defeat, right? I mean, politically speaking, he was nobody before this election, and now a lot of people are saying that he could be the post-Bolsonaro.
Well, I think that's true, that it's not a completely resounding defeat for Pablo Marçal. It's definitely not a great result, though, because, you know, you're mentioning that he could be the post-Bolsonaro. So he needs to be someone who's electable. And in his first time out, he failed to reach the runoff. He finished in third against, you know, someone like Ricardo Nunes, who doesn't have the same kind of star power that Marçal expects himself to have. So it is definitely a defeat that he's going to feel quite sorely. But you're right in saying at the same time is that this puts him well and truly on the map, not just in São Paulo. You see around Brazil, a lot of people in that kind of Bolsonaro right wing supporting Marçal, wearing his caps with his M logo, that sort of thing. And so he definitely does have that kind of nationwide appeal, and giving himself that stage that he has in the São Paulo election will, I think, be a net positive for him. But it's also going to be difficult, you know, further down his career when he tries to go for a bigger job, because he's proven himself not to be electable so far. I think one of the really interesting things about Marçal is that he represents a threat, I think, to the traditional power players on the Brazilian right, which the traditional power players on the Brazilian right are typically evangelical pastors. And when we're talking about evangelical pastors, that kind of their connection with their electorate is based on, you know, the prosperity doctrine. You know, if you pray enough, if you are pious, you will receive wealth, essentially. And often it doesn't work out that way, but that is the promise that they sell to their voters. But when you get someone like Pablo Marçal, who is a life coach, he essentially offers that exact same prosperity doctrine. And like, if you just follow what I'm saying, you're going to be wealthy, you're going to be successful. But in Marçal's case, there's no rules. You don't have to go to church. It's something that could easily supplant that kind of evangelical influence that you have on the right wing. And you can already see one of the main power players on the evangelical right in Brazil, Silas Malafaia, has really come out strongly against Pablo Marçal. He's picking fights with them in the newspapers, all that sort of thing. So you can see that he's noticed that the coaches, these kind of life coach right wing, is very dangerous for their political capital. But this is something that I think that maybe Jair Bolsonaro hasn't potentially recognized yet. So this is going to be one of these really interesting things to see in the future. And Pablo Marçal, I think, is the one who really embodies that movement more than anyone else at this stage.
Yeah, I would add to that is the problem for Mr. Marçal and this defeat actually being larger than it looks like. Because when your whole rhetoric, when your whole idea is based on success and you lose, then you are the loser. So it is a larger defeat than it sounds. Electorally, he's now much more famous than he was. But for his speech of success, he will now have to explain away his defeat as a loser, despite his whole thing being based on the fact that if you do these things, you will be a winner. And if you're not a winner, it's on you. It all depends on you. It doesn't depend on society. It doesn't depend on the government. It's all about you, whether you were a winner or a loser. And he's a loser because he lost.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point today. And I mean, Marcel said that he would eradicate poverty in São Paulo by changing people's mindset. Perhaps he didn't change his own mindset enough to to qualify for the runoff. Now, even a lot of people say that regardless of how well or Marcel did or did not fare, that the fact that he got so close actually offers a blueprint for conservatives to appeal to pro-Bolsonaro voters without necessarily having to kiss the ring. And I mean, how do you see this? And also the fact that, okay, Marcel may have presented that blueprint, but he could find himself ineligible for office, just like Bolsonaro is at the moment, right?
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, Marcel was, I mean, to put it very lightly, he was, he bent the rules, let's just say, during the São Paulo mayoral campaign. I mean, he definitely didn't just bend the rules; he broke quite a lot of the rules. And had he have qualified for the runoff, there was talk that his candidacy could potentially be impeached before that second round. I'm not sure whether that would have actually gone ahead, but there's definitely grounds for it. With a lot of his kind of incendiary antics, trying to get a rise out of his opponent, and then the case that really, I think, if there was to be any sort of impeachment of a candidacy, it would be based on this case, which was he presented a fake medical report allegedly concerning, well, not concerning at all, his opponent, Guilherme Boulos, saying that he had drug addiction, he had homicidal tendencies. The whole thing was complete fabrication. It was the name of the doctor that was included on the record. It was not his signature. That doctor has since passed away. Was just a complete fabrication, and one of those things that is just absolute concrete electoral crime. You can't do that in a democracy, in a democratic campaign, and where he had to have made the second round, that could have caused him problems. It might still cause him problems going forward, but that's definitely something that we'll just have to see once the dust settles in São Paulo, once we sort out this Nunes versus Boulos. And just one thing that we haven't touched on with the Nunes versus Boulos is that all signs are pointing towards the incumbent mayor being re-elected. Not technically re-elected because he wasn't elected in the first place, but being elected on 27th of October because of all the things that we've mentioned, and just because if you look at the results in the electoral zones in São Paulo, there are very few electoral zones where it was Guilherme Boulos and Pablo Marçal first and second. There are some in the far east of São Paulo, but the vast majority of them are Ricardo Nunes is the first or second. So even though he's not the most popular in all parts of the city, he's just got that kind of steady vote count, which pushed him through in the first round. And you would definitely expect a majority of Marçal's voters to go for Nunes in the second round. Again, we're going to have to wait and see if that plays out.
Yeah, it's also because voters do not necessarily follow a logic, right? We have people who voted for Lula, then Bolsonaro, then Lula again, and people who voted for Lula 2 years ago who are now voting Marçal. But like you said, one could assume that between a left-wing and a right-wing candidate, voters who picked a far-right candidate would be flocking towards the right-wing option. But even allow me to shift this conversation a little bit, because today alluded to something that I wanted to talk in this podcast, which is the fact that, for instance, in Porto Alegre, incumbent Mayor Sebastião Melo almost obtained an outright landslide victory, despite his alleged negligence in handling the city's sewage system, which made the floods that we saw this year much worse than they would have been if his office had dealt with these issues in a more adequate manner. Now, expanding this conversation, Brazil is facing a generational drought. Some communities in the Amazon have been left stranded as a multitude of the region's rivers are no longer navigable. Reservoir levels have worried regulators about energy availability in Brazil, and we are seeing the soybean belt experiencing the worst drought in 700 years. Did the climate issue play any role in the municipal elections? I mean, was Porto Alegre an outlier, or voters just didn't care about the climate everywhere across the map?
So did climate issues play a role in mayoral elections in Brazil? Short answer, no. Long answer, no. We did a piece in the week running up to the election where we looked at some of the major cities who have been most affected by the current wildfire crisis that we're seeing in the Amazon and parts of the Cerrado in Brazil. And I mean, if we could just take one example here, which is the most emblematic example, which is Porto Velho. This is the state capital of Rondônia in Brazil's north. And that's a city where, just like a month ago, you could barely see down to the end of your street. You could barely see to the next block because of just how thick the smoke was in the air. It had one of the worst air qualities in the world, recorded by these kind of air quality monitoring websites. Porto Velho had one of the worst in the world. And we looked at that particular campaign where the leading candidate, Mariana Carvalho, and we looked at her promises on her manifesto, and we also looked at her kind of Instagram output, like what she was passing on to her voters. And we found almost nothing that even mentioned the wildfire crisis or deforestation or climate or anything like that. It just really wasn't an issue for her whatsoever. And on Sunday, she won 45% of the vote in Porto Velho. And will be going to the second round with a pretty good advantage and a good chance of becoming mayor. And in that second round, she's going to be facing Leo Moraes, who we looked at his manifesto as well, 40 pages long, all text, very thick. Not once is the word fires, burning, deforestation. Any of these terms do not appear at any moment in the manifesto. And quite like his competitor, Mariana Carvalho, it was a topic that he completely overlooked. And that's it. This is a trend that we've just seen repeated across Brazil in various different cities. Potentially, you could say that this is a kind of desensitization to repeated disasters. We're living in the middle of a climate emergency, and these sorts of major tragic incidents are just becoming something quite, unfortunately, part of everyday life for Brazilians.
So there, we touched on this a little bit, but I want to expand with you because Brazilian pundits sometimes tend to overstate the influence of national politics on local races and vice versa. But do you think these elections now have taught President Lula any lessons in how he will have to deal with different political forces? Anything that we can see in terms of political trends moving forward?
I don't know if there are any major surprises for President Lula because since he was first president in 2003, he has negotiated extensively with the big center and has recognized the big center as a powerful political force. In the first years of his administration, of course, there were the Mensalão and Petrolão scandals where his administration bought these parties with cash, and now he needs to buy them with different things, such as pork and positions in the administration. But if there is any surprise, I would say, is the multiplication of little Bolsonaros in several major cities, including former ministers in his administration, such as Marcelo Queiroga, and the competitive chances of people very close to Bolsonaro, such as Bruno Engler, André Fernandes, Bruno Engler in Belo Horizonte, André Fernandes in Fortaleza, and so on, which means that the landscape has really changed in the sense that usually Brazilians would vote for the far right for Congress. As we say in Brazil, you vote for the liver. You vote with your liver means that you vote when you're angry, and they would elect people such as Nicolas Ferreira and Eduardo Bolsonaro for Congress. but these candidates usually didn't go very well for mayor. If you take the case, for example, former state assembly Mamãe Falei in São Paulo, he was the kind of Pablo Marçal in 2020, but he got a little over 10% of the vote, and he was not competitive in order to make it to the runoff. And now we had Pablo Marçal, and we have now similar Marçals nationwide qualifying for the runoff in major cities, which means that now more Brazilians are inclined to vote for the far right, even for the mayor, which is a very sensitive position because the mayor is the guy that you don't want to be a crazy person. It's the damage of a lunatic in Congress is much less than the guy that takes care of the trash, takes care of schools, takes care of school meals, takes care of traffic lights. So these are very serious issues where you don't want a person that is ideologically inclined to either side because there's business to be done in very, very sensitive things that are close to your home. And this scenario has really changed.
Sede, Ewan, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts, or better yet, subscribe to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your memberships fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. And our work has been recognized for its quality. We have won or been shortlisted for several international journalism awards. More recently, the Brazilian Report won the Best News Website in Latin America award by the World Association of News Publishers, WANIFRA, for small or local newsroom. We also won a similar award for Best Newsletter in the Americas. And to continue this work, we need your support. Go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. I'm Gustavo Ribeiro. Thanks for listening. Explaining Brazil will be back next week.